Good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Conversations on Zoom, number 42. I'm Mark Kligman, and I'm speaking to you from Los Angeles. We're glad that we can all gather together. And with Geraldine Auerbach in London, it's really a wonderful opportunity for us to continue our weekly conversations. Today, our conversation is looking at a really prolific and wonderful composer, Michael Isaacson, and he will be in conversation with Marsha Dubrow. First, let me introduce Marsha Dubrow. Marsha Dubrow recently stepped down Emerita from her role as Rabbi and Cantor of Congregation B'nai Jacob in Jersey City, New Jersey. She is, since 2018, a visiting scholar in Jewish music at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Our composer, our guest today is Michael Isaacson. He is the founding artistic director of the Israeli Pops Orchestra and the Milken Archive of American Jewish Music. Michael Isaacson enjoys a distinguished career as a composer, a conductor, producer, author, and educator with over 1,000 Jewish and secular music compositions published, including instrumental, vocal, sacred, and secular arrangements, additions and education works in 3 volumes, 750 a 750-page Michael Isaacson songbook, and over 50 produced CDs and album recordings. And I can say one more thing about Michael Isaacson is that he's led the true Jewish life, triangulating America by growing up in Brooklyn, by then being in Los Angeles for a few decades, and now is celebrating his 4th anniversary residing in Florida. So without further ado, and thank you all for your patience, Marsha Dubrow and Michael Isaacson.
Thank you, Mark. It is a pleasure to be with everyone today. And what a great honor it is to have the opportunity to have this conversation with Dr. Michael Isaacson. Well over 500 compositions and 50 CDs of Jewish sacred music are just one of the accomplishments of this immensely prolific composer of Jewish music, to say nothing of his secular music. Michael has been honored as one of the 10 most influential living composers of Jewish music by the American Society for Jewish Music, the Hebrew Union College, and the Jewish Theological Seminary. Over the past weeks, Michael and I have had many wide-ranging conversations about a host of Jewish musical topics, and I look forward very much to further exploring them with him today. His voluminous catalog of works for the synagogue, life cycle events, and many other occasions has resulted from a very fascinating life story in terms of both experiences and influences, which we're looking forward to hearing about very much, as well as the music that was forthcoming from those experiences. But we want to be sure to save time at the end to explore specifically the idea of Minhag America across a timeline of late 20th century and early 21st century decades, where Michael thinks sacred Jewish music is going and why. So we're going to work chronologically and go through the major 4 chapters of your life, Michael, having an opportunity to both hear your work and hear how it came to be from you, the composer, and why it sounded like it did. Perhaps as we go through the years and the experiences, you could reflect with us upon what you were trying to create. What was your inspiration? And with more complicated works, what was your compositional process? What is your balance between inspiration and perspiration, as Thomas Edison said? Of course, I know for you, inspiration is much more than his 1%. because he said it was 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. So I know that your quotient is way higher than that, maybe 50-50, but you'll let us know. So let's start. Are you ready, Michael? To begin, tell us about your early background. What kind of a home did you grow up in? What about your early Jewish education? And what kind of synagogue did you attend?
You need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now? I can't hear you.
Yes, okay.
Okay. As long as you could hear me, I guess we're okay, Julian. Thank you. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I went to Yeshiva Rambam, an American-style yeshiva in those days. Went to an Orthodox synagogue, but it was American Orthodox in the sense that the women sat on an aisle between the men. There was no mechitza or anything like that. Although the rabbi did wear formal morning, afternoon clothes when he made his sermon, so I thought that was a nice touch. And I spent a lot of wonderful Shabbat afternoons around the table of friends, singing and learning. And I must say, as an oral learner, singing around the table was my rote experience for learning texts and styles and values. And I recalled this body of music before I cited any of it. And I must take one moment to offer a caveat, because I have such notables as Alexander Knapp and Michael Levitt in the audience. And I have to tell you that I come to you as a composer. I don't come to you as an authority of Jewish music, even though I wrote a book on it called What Makes Jewish Music Jewish, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But my sensibility is that of a composer. So if you ask me about a G sharp in measure 242 of a work of mine, I'll defer to your expertise. Having said that, I had a very rich childhood, and I learned the whole Ashkenazic syndrome and spectrum of music, and also Yiddish. I went to the Yiddish theater on 2nd Avenue and heard Elstein and Secunda and all those people, and saw Molly Pecan do a somersault on stage. And it was in the 50s, I think. I had a very rich Jewish background. I absolutely hated yeshiva because they were so left-brained. You know, I see much of my life between the left brain and the right brain. The left brain was the linear thinking, of rabbis, and the right brain was the more musical, for lack of better reason, of Cantor. And so I thought that the yeshiva showed me that there was an intrinsic mistrust for the right brain in Judaism. Yeshiva trains little rabbis to think left brain, while the right brain is left to die slowly of abuse and suffocation. You point to a Hebrew word, there's Targum, you translate it, and you go on to the next, and that's the yeshiva training. And it wasn't until the 8th grade in yeshiva that I was heard that there was a word makela, a choir. And once I was told that I was going to sing in a makela, my right brain went, oh! And I began to breathe with my right side of my brain in Judaism, and it made all the difference in the world. So I hope that answers your question. If it wasn't for those lunches on Shabbat around the table, the Tish music, I would have suffocated to death. But that music kept me alive until I could explore on my own the life of music in Judaism.
And how did a nice yeshiva bacher like you end up at the Reform Kutz camp? And how did you write music at the camp?
First of all, I wasn't a nice yeshiva bucher. They were glad to see me go. I was a Luftmensch. You know, do you ever see that Roman Vishniak picture where that little yeshiva boy is looking up at the sky saying, when am I going to get out of here? Well, that's who I was. I was just wanting to breathe fresh air. So I went to, my mother first put me in Mesivta Gur Aryeh, that's what they called it then. And it was a one-room Gemara schoolhouse. And I said, no more, let me go to a public high school. I went to Madison High School, Sheepshead Bay High School. Instantly discovered the music program, wallowed in it in all aspects, choral, instrumental, played the tuba, played the trombone, sang in the chorus, did whatever I had to do. You know, I played piano. And then I went to Hunter College and studied music education. And one summer I said to myself, you know, every summer I get hired as a music and dramatics counselor in some camp. And at the end of August, I come home as pale and pasty as I was in June because I spent the whole summer indoors putting on plays. So I'd really like to get a nice tan. So I heard that they needed a lifeguard at COZ Camp, which was the Reform, I call it a think tank. It was the National Federation of Temple Youth Camp. And I was lifeguard there, and I roomed with an interesting rabbi. His name was Lawrence Kushner. Larry Kushner then was a student rabbi, and he was put in charge of doing Erev Shabbat services. And one day he came over to me and he says, you know, somebody heard you play piano in the faculty lounge. Can you write music? I said, no, I'm a lifeguard. I'm a lifeguard this summer. He said, no, we need music for a service. And they said, you're the one to do it. I said, please, I just want to get a suntan and watch pretty girls by the pool. That's all I want to do. So he imposed on me. I went into a little shack where they had a piano, and I wrote some settings for the service. To me, it was just summer fun. I wasn't pretending to do anything more than that. And ironically, it caught on as the nifty folk service by the end of that summer, and Michael Isaacson was known as a synagogue composer. I really had no plan on doing this at all, but obviously I brought something to it that was interesting because the campers would bring this music home with them at the end of the summer, and the cantors would perform it at their temples. And it was that time when, you know, folk music was in vogue. And so the transference was made. But I tell you most honestly that I had no plans on making this a career. I assumed that I would become a music school teacher, and it was a very noble profession, and I was looking forward to it. And I was then commissioned by many congregations to write services, which I proceeded to do, and the rest is, as they say, history.
So let's hear now two selections from that period of your life when you were wrangled into composing music that would be appropriate for a Friday night service. And we'll hear first the Via Hafta, and Doug Mishkin is singing and doing the vocals and guitar. And just in the interest of time, I might have to cut off a bit early, but you'll get the flavor of what we're doing because we have a lot of music to listen to.
La 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 la. La 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 la. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha uv'chol nafshecha ובכל מאודיך la 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 la.
And let's go on to the Shema Yisrael.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, forever and ever, forever and ever. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Echad.
Now we move into chapter 2.
By the way, I want to remind people that even in those early days when I was doing guitar ditties for the camp, I used the trope for the Shema. Di-da-dam, bam, ba-da-dam. Did you all hear that? So I did know it, and I just didn't want to hit them over the head with it, with 3 trumpets and 4 horns. But I did try and use some Jewish materials even then as a lifeguard.
You were sneaking it in, so to speak, hoping they'd absorb it by osmosis. That's great. So composition studies, how did you know and when that you wanted to study composition seriously?
Well, when I was at Hunter College, I was asked by the theater department to do some incidental scores for productions, Mad Woman of Shiloh, Under a Milkwood. I did also the Dybbuk. And again, these were just very interesting ways of spending time. It wasn't concerted, I wanted to study composition, and I graduated Hunter College with a music degree in education, music education. Then, of course, there was this little thing happening at that time called the Vietnam War. And I really didn't have a major desire to die in a rice paddy. So I decided that I would go back for formal composition studies in Brooklyn College with Robert Starrer. And I brought in those incidental scores that I wrote at Hunter. And the first week he said, Mad Woman of Shiloh, interesting French music. And then the next week I brought in Under Milk. He says, very interesting Welsh music and so forth. And finally he hollered at me and said, get out of my studio and don't come back until you bring me Isaacson music. And then I was faced with a cathartic moment. I had to find out what Isaacson music was. And the study with him produced an understanding of what I was capable. And he was really my first composition teacher who insisted on making every note count and having a texture that let in air and negative space between the notes, something that Jewish music rarely had for me at that time. Everything was, either a tremolando going on in the bass and lots of oiving. And I wanted to write a more transparent kind of music, and he encouraged me to do that. And with him, I wrote my first commission service, Hegion Libi, the meditation of my heart, and also a setting of the 23rd Psalm.
So first we're going to listen to the 23rd Psalm.
But please do me a favor, 2 things, Marsha, I ask you. leave the cursor on the bottom of the page because it keeps on humming around the visual. And second of all, I would appreciate it if you played the entire piece. This is because this needs it, okay?
Yes, I was planning to.
Okay, thanks a lot.
But thinking we're on the same page.
Okay, good.
מזמור לדוד, אדוני רואי לא אחסר, בנאות דשא ירביצני, על מי מנוחות ינהלני, נפשי ישובב, ינחני במעגלי צדק, למען שמו. גם כי אלך בקצר מוות, לא אירא רע, כי אתה עמדי, שבטך ומשענתך, המה ינחמוני. תערוך לפניי שולחן נגד צורריי, תשענת ושמן ראשי, כוסי רוויה. אך טוב וחסד ירדפוני כל ימי חיי, ושבתי בבית אדוני לאורך ימים.
That is so beautiful, Michael.
By the way, the Cantor Faith Steinschneider, who sang this so beautifully, is listening in today. So thank you very much, Faith. We're working on a new album now of my high holiday music, and I can't wait to work with her again. She has been the perfect voice for my music, and I'm very grateful to her all of my professional life.
Wonderful. It's a great marriage, if you will.
Mhm.
Very much so. And I see that it was a good thing that Starr insisted that you let in that negative space and air, because look at what you produced just from that wisdom. So very impressive, very impressive. Now you mentioned the Hegyon Libi. Tell us about why you chose to compose a Friday night service. Of course, this was the first of what was to become many Michael Isaacson Friday night services over the course of your career. And why title it Hegyon Libi?
Well, I was contacted by Cantor Robert Harmon, Zichrono Livracha, from Temple Emmanuel in Great Neck, New York. And one of his kids went to camp and heard my music and said, I like Michael Isaacson music, you should commission him. So he did. And he was such a wonderful man. And he said, what kind of service would you like to write? Well, in those days, I dreamt aloud. I still do, I guess, but I was very vocal about it. And I said to him, you know, I've never heard a Friday evening service with string quartet and organ and choir, and I think we should have a string quartet. I did hear, when I went to Israel, I did hear at HUC they had a cello, flute, and cantor. There was that trio going on. But I never heard a string quartet. And so he said, okay, write whatever you hear. He was really wonderful about it. And Hegyon Libi, because it was the first opportunity for me to bring my heart into the equation as opposed to reproducing the music of other people that I heard in Jewish music. I knew a lot about other Jewish composers by then, but they certainly didn't know a lot about me, and so I wanted to be as expressive as I could with those materials.
So we're going to have an opportunity now to hear from the Hegyon Libi, Meditation of the Heart. I think it's interesting to note that this was composed when Michael was still working on his master's degree, and it was published in 1977 when he was at the Eastman School of Music at the University of Rochester. And we'll get to that after we listen to Cantor Rosalind Barak in a magnificent performance of the Kiddush from Michael's Hegyon Libi.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei peri hagafen Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu v'shabbat kodsho b'ahava uv'ratzon hinchilanu zikaron למעשה וראשית כי הוא יום תחילון המקרא קודש זכר ליציאת מצרים כי בנו בחרת ואותנו קידשת בשבת קודשך באהבה וברצון הנחלתנו Baruch atah Adonai Mekadesh HaShabbat.
You know, I can just see Star's face.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Michael. Sorry.
I just wanted to say I could just see Robert Starr's face when I was writing that. It seems inconceivable to me that it was over 50 years ago. But he was such a strong influence on my writing because he demanded that every note that I put on that page mean it. And I couldn't double notes if there wasn't a purpose for doubling notes. That's how transparent he was in teaching composition. And it held me in very good stead, and I'm so grateful to him that I had the opportunity to study with him 50 years ago, my dear. Okay,
Okay.
let's move on.
Okay.
Fatima.
The Eastman years. Did you go on to Eastman for your PhD directly after receiving your MA?
Well, to tell you the truth, I taught as a I had the strange job in the Board of Education to be a permanent substitute. They had a classification, and when the chairman of a department left on sabbatical for more than 4 or 5 months, they sent me in there to take care of the department while he was away. So I taught at the High School of Performing Arts, and I taught at very nice high schools. And then I was still, again, fighting this Vietnam thing, and I decided to go to Eastman. But while I applied for Eastman, I also applied to Hebrew Union College to become a rabbi. I figured, one of the two, and I didn't think I had a great voice as a cantor, so maybe I could go as a rabbi, and they accepted me. They accepted me. So here I was between Scylla and Charybdis, the Lady of the Tiger. I had 2 letters of acceptance to the Eastman School as a composer and to Hebrew Union College as a rabbinic student. And I said to myself, if the world was coming to an end in a month, would I want to be studying again Talmud, or do I want to be writing music? So I went to Eastman. And that's how the decision was made. But I didn't know the quality of education that I would get at the Eastman School. It was just sensational. I studied, as you can see, with Sam Adler and Warren Benson. And Sam, who is 93 today, is still my teacher. He's a very good friend of mine. And whenever I write something, I am very happy to send it to him for his critique. And he always pays me the honor of really studying the music and telling me what he thinks about it in specific terms. And I always learn something from him. So who ever thought of having a composition teacher for 50 years? It's sensational.
Great. I know you studied with Sam and Warren Benson,
Right.
and I know it was a while ago, but can you describe what the course of your curriculum was for music composition then? What did you study beyond music theory? Did you study the works of great composers from history? How did you learn your compositional techniques?
Well, the degree that I was in was a PhD in composition. I already had my master's, and they were still trying to figure it out at Eastman also. This was the first time. So instead of learning, for a DMA now, you need to have 2 languages maybe, and write a piece and then, or give a concert recital, and you become a DMA. I had to learn to read and translate 3 foreign languages plus a language of my choice, 4 languages. I had to, of course, know the repertoire, Western Civ. I also had to know orchestration backwards and forwards and the history of Western Civ. So they really worked me hard, which was great. And while I was at Eastman, I also was contacted by Len Hawley, who was the bar mitzvah music king in Rochester, New York. And he said, I understand that you know all the freilichs to play on the piano. And I said, well, I think I do. He says, okay, I got 3 jobs for you every weekend to play for weddings and bar mitzvahs. So while I was studying music, I was playing. I had more money in the world than I knew what to do with. It was just a sensational time. I met some lovely, lovely people who I still am in contact with. And it really changed my life. Matter of fact, I am in the process now of endowing an annual Jewish music concert at Eastman, which will, I hope, begin next year and explore the repertoire in the fullest sense. So that's my way of giving back and saying thank you to Eastman. It was a wonderful time.
Wow, that's really wonderful, paying it forward, as we say. That's great. Now, you had told me that both of these gentlemen taught you to think and create like a professional composer. You mentioned the phrase simultaneous time and fill in the holes in the catalog. Now, I kind of get what fill in the holes in the catalog means, because that's more the making money side, I thought. But what did they mean by simultaneous time?
Well, I'll talk about filling the holes in the catalog, because it's much more than just making money.
Okay.
Simultaneous time means this: whenever in composition you look at a measure of music, that measure of music exists in 3 simultaneous time: past, present, and future. If you don't see a resonance of what happened before this measure occurred in that measure, you haven't really thought out the past of that measure. At the same time, you have to work to make that measure a compelling sound event. And then, if you're very lucky, you will figure out some energy to project that measure into the future. So that, according to a theoretical basis, all you have to do is write one measure of music, and then know that measure so well that it tells you where to go in for the next measure. And so they say, the thing is, so how do you get the first measure? Where's the past of the first measure? The past is your experiences, your sound experiences, your life experiences, and that's what we call inspiration, that first measure. But I've always thought that after that first measure of inspiration, you better have some craft, because otherwise inspiration won't bring you back to the second measure. You need the craft to understand the first measure's energies to bring you into the second. That's simultaneous time. Now, let me speak briefly about filling the holes in the catalog. The Cantor's Assembly presently has a project that I've been listening to, and I know Robert Keevel and Gaina are online, and I love them very much. But I have heard more Lechadodes in the last couple of weeks than I cared to hear for the rest of my life. And the reason why I say that is because there are so many texts that have never been said, that I would hope that the Cantor's Assembly returns to a time when Samuel Rosenbaum actually commissioned new settings of pieces that were needed to be set. And this was the golden age, as far as I'm concerned, of the Cantor's Assembly. So when it says fill the holes in the catalog, it means when you say, what am I going to write next? If there are 400 settings of Adon Olam and Lecha Dodi and Yigdal or whatever it is, and you write another one, this next one better be the best one ever written. Otherwise, it's going to get lost in the shuffle. You better write it a different way. For example, I learned this because Warren Benson said to me, what do you want to write next? I said, I'd like to tackle a string quartet. And he said, do you know how many string quartets have been written? He says, Mozart. I mean, how are you going to compete with all of these wonderful people writing a string quartet? What's your idea? How are you going to make this different? And then I had to think of the holes in the catalog. So I wound up writing a piece for solo clarinet and string quartet, where they have a kind of concerto back and forth. And it was my way of finding a hole in the catalog, something that had not been done yet. And I recommend it to everyone who is in a position of commissioning music. Let's not keep on doing this redundant thing of write another this, that. Let's try something new and go to texts that haven't been said in ways that it hasn't been said. And that's finding the holes in the catalog. And now you know my complete Eastman School education. It served me well for over 50 years.
Okay, great. So you wrote during your time at Eastman a complete slichot service. And I believe you told me it was your doctoral thesis. And we're going to hear now a wonderful performance of the Avinu Malkeinu from that service, and Cantor Nathan Lamb is performing with a choir.
Before you click it, let me just set up something for you. Following up on what I said about redundancies. I thought long and hard about, why do I need to write an Avinu Malkeinu? We had the folk Avinu Malkeinu, which everybody loves and looks forward to each year. We had Avinu Malkeinu, which was absolutely, after Barbara Streisand, who could write. And so I said to myself, what is the purpose of my writing this Avinu Malkeinu? And in it, you will hear Nathan Lamb begin solo as one single person praying to God. And then, contrasting to that, I had to understand that we also not only pray as individuals when we go to synagogue, we pray in a congregation. And so the next time you hear this Avinu Malkeinu, it's in a very elaborate harmonization. But then I said to myself, finally, the point of this Avinu Malkeinu, aside from being, I hope, a nice thing to listen to, a compelling thing to listen to, is that it recognizes that even when we are in a congregation singing and praying, we are still individuals, and we have to make peace between the balance of being one in a crowd and being an individual talking to our Maker. And this was the purpose of this Avinu Malkeinu.
Avinu Malkeinu Chaneinu Va'aneinu Ki enanu masim Asei imanu tzedaka Asei imanu chesed V'hoshienu Avinu Malkeinu Chaneinu Avinu
So beautiful. And so different from anything else that had come before, and perhaps after as well. The Cleveland years, chapter 3. So Michael, what took you to Cleveland?
Well, after Eastman, I got a job teaching at the State University of New York in Fredonia, and I was conducting a 300-voice master chorale and doing all of the, everything from the Vivaldi Gloria and the Bach Magnificat to, we did Aaron Copland's In the Beginning and Cartuli Carmina, Orff. And I was really getting chops as a conductor, a choral conductor, and doing a lot of arrangements for chorus. And then I got a call from Rabbi Daniel Silver, who was the son of Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver from Cleveland. He had the largest, it was like a cathedral synagogue in Cleveland. They knew it was Tifereth Israel, but they knew it as Silver's Temple. And he offered me a job. Listen to this job. One day a week, I would be conducting the Case Western Reserve Chorus. 2 days a week, I would be teaching at the Cleveland Institute of Music, Composition and Orchestration. And then the rest of the week, I would be music director of the temple. And he said to us, your mission is to take us away from Reform, classic Reform Judaism, and bring us into the 20th century. So how could I not? It was irresistible. How could I not take up a challenge like that? And he took me to the suburbs where they had this new temple, and it was made up of wood, and it was in a wooded area, and it had a wooden ark, and everything was polished and woody. And he said to me, what kind of music do you envision in this space? And I said to him, wood. I hear a lot of wood. I hear woodwinds, and I hear harps, and I hear pianos and voices and oboes, and I hear wood. So he said, okay, now listen to this. They were so classic Reform that their main service was on Sunday morning still.
Oh, my.
That's just to give you an idea of it. And so I started writing morning service for the weekday, which, I mean, I must have 4 or 5 full services for morning service on the weekday that nobody has ever heard nor will ever hear because nobody ever uses them. If somebody wants to do an esoteric doctorate, they could do it on my morning services. But I found out something very true about synagogues and temples. And at this juncture, I have to be a bit analytic and maybe even a bit acerbic. I've learned that if you want progress to happen, it doesn't necessarily happen so much in a synagogue or a temple. That's the last place it happens, because there's a vested interest in tradition, whatever that means, what you know from last year, and perpetuating that. After a year of being Bach and writing all of these services for the temple, the Rebbitzin came into my office and she said, there's been a lot of flack from the congregation. They want to go back to the old redback hymnal. If those of you who are know services, you know about that. They want to sing Spicker, Sparker, and Schlesinger. And so you better talk to the rabbi. So I went to Dan's office. And he said, well, change comes hard. And he said, maybe we'll let it go for 2 or 3 years and try again. I said, Rabbi, you're perfectly welcome to do that. But I didn't sign on for that. I signed on for change and to bring something new into the world. And I just don't want to be peddling, for 3 years before I have a chance to do that. So we left on very amicable terms. And I had met my wife, Susie. We had gotten married. And I said, I'm looking at TV and watching the music that's on TV and listening to it. I think I could write that stuff. I'd like to try going out to Los Angeles and see if I could be a TV and film composer. And she said, God bless her heart. She said, okay. And, you know, she had a nice job in Cleveland and we were all set in Cleveland. She said, no, okay, I'm willing for the adventure. And I went to Los Angeles with Susie in a little Corolla. And we knew nobody and I had no connections. And I started my freelance career, which lasted over 40 years.
Okay, so before we leave Cleveland,
Okay.
I thought it would be worthwhile, given everything we've heard thus far, for us to listen to your setting of the Psalm 150, which you shared with me was composed for the 50th anniversary celebration of the synagogue. Did I get that right?
The 150th.
That's what I meant, 150th.
Yeah, and they wanted a big piece and a showy piece. And even though it wasn't my compositional style, I figured I was servicing the album, so I gave them a blockbuster of a setting.
And actually, you may not have realized it at the time, but it might have been good preparation for where you were next headed. So let's listen. And so you
you left out that big ending. I'm so heartsick.
Okay. Oh, okay. I'm just mindful of time, so we can go back. No worries.
Okay.
I'll plug it in. I know it's great. It is great, but you know, I just wanted to make sure that I was not getting us too off our timetable. Let's go to here. Okay, now I'm glad you brought that back to life, because I was going to ask you if you had embedded that tekiah or the teruah at the end of that 150th. Had you?
Of course. How do you write it? How do you write 150 for a temple and not include a tekiah?
That was great. I picked it up after we had started to talk about, you know, these little embeddings that you did in different pieces. And then when I heard it, I thought, oh, that's so cool. I thought that was great. So now we're on our way to LA, and I just have to get us there. So hold on one sec. Oops, I'm going in all kinds of directions. Okay. So we already talked about why you went to LA and what happened. And I thought it was a very, how shall we say, grounded strategy, because you were going into a world where they needed composers and they were willing to pay for them, namely Hollywood. And there was the opportunity, I'm assuming that the opportunities during that era were vast because they hadn't yet gone to giving up live musicians, et cetera, for the orchestrations. And I found it so interesting that you also worked with you still continued to work on Jewish music. You worked with two cantors there, Jay Freilich and Nathan Lamb. And I was wondering how you came to have a relationship with them. Had you known them from before, or how did that working relationship come about?
Well, first of all, it's very nice of you to think that they were welcoming me with open arms, but that wasn't the case. There are always more talented composers than are needed in LA, and one has to be a bit of a chameleon and write in different styles and write quickly and understand what the job is about. And also in between, when you don't have a job and when you think you're never going to work again and you won't have any food on the table because a freelancer never knows when they're going to work next, you have to have a wife who is steadfast and loving to you, and I had the best. We didn't know what we were getting ourselves in for, but we had quite an adventure. The reason how I met Jay Freilich and Nathan Lamb, I sent out letters to people and I said, hello, my name is Michael Isaacson. Maybe you've heard some of my synagogue music. I'm here in LA. I'm trying to develop a career as a TV and film composer. And if I can do anything for your congregation, please let me know. It was a straight solicitation letter. And Jay responded. I think he was the first to respond. And he was at University Synagogue in Brentwood. And he, in those days, Marsha, it was commendable to commission music. The whole feeling of the time was to create something new. Today, everybody wants to get it off of YouTube or take it off of Facebook, and there's very little commissioning going on. But in those days, people were interested in finding out what we could do that would be interesting and new. And Jay wanted to do that. And so I must have written for his congregation 30 pieces, ranging from a shofar service for the high holidays to settings in the gates of prayer and so forth. And then Nate Lamb came to me and he said, look, he said, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse. And I didn't refuse it either. He said, by this time we had two boys, we had two sons. He says, I want them to have a nice Jewish education, so I will admit them to the day school, the Stephen S. Wise Day School, and in return, you become our composer in residence. You'll record for us, you'll arrange for me, you'll do whatever we need musically, and I will take care of their tuition. And I said, gee, that sounds like the best of both worlds. I'm in. And for the next, I would say, maybe 10 or 15 years, that was our relationship. And it was a very productive one. I went with Nate to Israel for the first time to conduct an album with the Israel Philharmonic. And through that association, I did 14 more CDs with the Israel Philharmonic, but I'll tell you about them later if you ask me. I see you have Al Hanisim up, but let me set this up for you before you play it. Jay Freilich had a children's choir, and I had small children who were watching Sesame Street. And it was Hanukkah, and I said, how am I going to write an Al Hanisim that's never been written before? Because I'm always trying to find the holes in the catalog. So I listened to Joe Raposo music for Sesame Street.
Amazing.
And I know that you know Joe. And I wrote in that style. I don't think I stole anything from Joe, but I wrote in the style. And you know something? After all these years, every Hanukkah, there are a lot of performances of it around the country, and I still think it holds up pretty good. And it's different than anything you've heard. It's not like my camp music. It's not like my, concert music. This was written for my two boys and all the little kids who are going to sing it.
I think it's really effective. So here we go. Certainly rousing, certainly rousing. So now we come to something a bit different. You apparently had a suite commissioned by 43 synagogues. And the goal was to have the piece simultaneously premiered for the millennial. That was, I guess, the reason for the commissioning. And this is another piece for children's chorus with Cantor J. Freilich. And it has a very different tone to it and feeling to it. And I thought it was really very interesting because I wanted to, at this point, ask you about your lyricists. You've written a lot of dramatic works and extended cantatas and such with words. How do you determine if a song or a composition that is part of the Jewish liturgy needs English words?
Well, certainly these days, everything sung in Hebrew has to have an English version of it because nobody understands Hebrew anymore. But in those days, I was trying to develop a new audience of young people who were not going into the synagogue so much. After bar mitzvah, you know the old joke, if you want to get rid of a kid, you get him bar mitzvah. So I was also intrigued by the fact that in Jewish life, there's a great bit of redundancy. You're doing your thing at your congregation, you're doing your thing in the same community at your congregation, and because each congregation has limited funds, the result is always okay, but it's not fantastic. And I, having worked in the Borscht Belt, in the Catskills in the mountains, knew that if one act could play a lot of different hotels at the same time, you can get a better act. You know, you could get a Steve and Edie Gourmet to play in in the Catskills if you promise them, not only the Concord, but Grocingers and so forth. In other words, if there was synergy, if instead of one congregation doing, 43 congregations could come in and celebrate the millennial with a service that was interchangeable. In other words, I wrote a recorded soundtrack accompaniment that could be played whether the congregation had 50 members or had 400 or 500 members. So the poorer, in quotes, congregations wouldn't feel like they're not giving their kids, the opportunity to sing. And this was nicely orchestrated and so forth beforehand. And a matter of fact, one girl was learning this service in New Jersey at a large congregation. And her mother said, "Oh, that weekend we have to go up to Boston for a bar mitzvah. We won't." And she was heartsick that she couldn't sing this service that she was learning with her chorus. She went up to Boston for the bar mitzvah. They were doing the service, and because the accompaniment was pre-recorded, it was the same accompaniment. She said, "May I sing with the choir?" And of course, the woman said, "Of course." And she got to sing her service. So we have yet to explore this.
Yes.
If we would rethink our desire to be independent, even though we're redundant in programming, and go for something bigger, we would have absolutely beautiful pieces to offer everyone, nicely orchestrated, nicely arranged, with forces, performing forces that are unavailable to the single congregation. So that is a background. Now, I have to correct you for one thing, Marsha. Cantor J. Freilich is not the soloist on this. It's a very special soloist.
Okay.
And I see that Benny Meisner is listening to us. So I'll tell you that the soloist is Ben Steinberg.
Oh, okay.
And Ben Steinberg, of course, was a good friend and a wonderful composer. And he also had a lovely, almost Irish tenor voice. So I said, "Would you be the cantor on this?" And he said, "Okay." And he did a lovely job. So here's Ben Steinberg as the soloist.
I will definitely need to be corrected.
Okay.
Ben Steinberg has, he himself is a good, wonderful composer. Okay, so we're going to listen to this piece. And before we get into the piece, I just wanted to ask you how you find good lyricists, because we started to get on the subject of lyrics, and not everything that I've chosen to present today is necessarily one of your works where you did have to work with a lyricist, identify a lyricist, and then have a working relationship with that lyricist. I know you were in the highly selective Lehman Engel BMI musical theater workshop, as I had the good fortune of being in as well. Did that experience where you spend time in the first year rotating among lyricists, composing songs, did that make a difference for you in your development? Did that have an impact on what you learned about words and music?
It's a wonderful question. And absolutely, I mean, after every piece that was done, we would choose a lyricist and work with them and collaborate. And sometimes it was successful, and sometimes, that if it was very quiet in the room, you had bombed. But if people spent a lot of time hashing over it, you said, well, maybe this has some possibilities. And so I learned what a good lyric was, that before I ask any lyricist to work with me, I always give them a concept. I say, look, this is what I'm trying to accomplish in this music. And let's work with the language to make that happen. So I feel like I give a lot of energy to a lyricist. And I've had 3 or 4 lyricists in my lifetime. Susan Nuremberg, who wrote to Light the Legend, and Doug Thiel, who has written many, many wonderful settings with me. And I always am very happy to share credit with them because it's a collaboration. And the important thing to remember is that it is a collaboration. They bring ideas, you bring ideas, and then hopefully what you set out to do will be accomplished.
Great. Well, let's listen to this. And I don't know if you recall, but do you recall who you worked with on the lyrics for this, or were they already established?
Yeah, no, Children Sing to God, the lyric is by Doug Thiel.
Okay, great. Thank you.
ישראל עמך תשים לעולם, כי אתה הוא מלך אדון לכל השלום, וטוב בעיניך לברך את עמך ישראל בכל עת ובכל שעה. Israel
Lovely. And I see we've had some comments of people in the chat who had actually performed that piece with their children's choirs. So maybe at the end, when we have the Q&A, they'll share with us their memories of that time. So now we go ahead.
By the way, I am happy to report that if this was in the Guinness Book of Records as the largest commissioning of synagogue music, I don't think it's been topped yet. And I challenge the Cantors Assembly and the ACC and Transcontinental Music to knock me off the Guinness Book of Records and commission larger works around the country so that we can use this synergistic energy to create really wonderful music.
It's a fabulous model, and it brings people together so nicely in terms of distance, especially now with all the Zoom activity.
And that was 21 years ago. All the little kids who sang it are now mommies and daddies.
Okay, so here's another commission. The commission for the Museum of Jewish Heritage for their permanent Holocaust exhibition. And you created a relationship with the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra. So before we get into it, why don't you tell us about that relationship?
Well, I want you to know that when I was in yeshiva as a kid, every year we were given JNF tags to go door to door in Brooklyn and to sell these JNF tags because, ladies and gentlemen, I am 2 years older than the modern state of Israel. So from a very early age, I felt like a chalutznik in Brooklyn. And Israel has always been a love of mine. And to combine music and Zionism and Israel in one package, which is the Israel Philharmonic, you know, I'm sure you have all seen the wonderful film An Orchestra of Exiles, telling about how Uberman created the Israel Philharmonic. When Nate Lamott, Stephen Weiss says, where do you want to record the music that we were doing together? I said, I would love to go to Tel Aviv and record it at Mann Auditorium with the Israel Philharmonic. And in those days, that wasn't a problem. So we got on a plane, we made the connections and so forth. And I recorded with the orchestra for the first time. And when you record with the Israel Philharmonic for the first time, it's like defending your thesis. You know, it's like having a final in music. Everybody says to you, are you sure you want it on the bow, off the bow? Do you want it staccato, spiccato? And they, you know, it's really to the extent of almost pill pull. You have to say, listen, I got to get this done in 3 hours. Let's make some music already. But after they have challenged you and chewed on the music and discussed it with you and figured out every which way to perform it, they give the most lovely performances. And we fell in love with each other. I brought back 14 projects to conduct with the Israel Phil, and I consider them my second family. They are wonderfully dedicated. I mean, those of you before Pesach have seen that wonderful music they did around the Seder table. You know what a wonderful esprit they have. And now that Zubin is gone, Lahav Shani is a new conductor, and he is sensational. He's like a young Leonard Bernstein. So I went there from 1990 to 2000, something like that, every year with a new project to record with them. And I got to know Israel very well and made wonderful friends. And then when this Holocaust Museum project happened, they wanted me to write music for 33, listen to this, 33 short films in the permanent Holocaust exhibition, because now I was a film composer as well as a Jewish composer. And so there weren't many people who could bring to the table what I was bringing to the table. And if you've ever been to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, you know that the second floor is all of the Holocaust exhibit. If you go to Manhattan, it's in Battery Park, overlooking the Statue of Liberty. So after this intense experience of seeing all the pictures and hearing all the stories, they were smart enough when they designed this museum to make a little room where people could be by themselves and collect their thoughts about the experience that they had just bore on their shoulders. It was a very emotional experience. And they wanted a piece of music playing in the background while they sobbed, while they cried, while they got themselves together. You know, you don't very often get a challenge to write music to sob by, but
Right.
that was the assignment. And so I think this came close to fulfilling that goal.
Very much. Get your handkerchiefs ready. Wow, I found myself sighing and breathing into the rhythm. it was almost as if you incorporated a tempo and emotion in the melody that actually conformed to human breathing. I was wondering if that was something that was on your mind.
Well, in light of a complete disclosure, I have to tell you that this is about the same time that Schindler's List was in the movies. And whenever I hear Schindler's List, I said, "Oh, if I only had the talent of John Williams." But I kind of used it as a model in terms of the string feeling and texture and so forth. And I also remembered what Starra taught me about negative space and air and letting it breathe. So your comment about the breathing is a very interesting one that I never consciously thought about, but could very well be. It was a chance for everybody to catch their breath, absolutely.
Well, now we turn to going back to the other coast, to the Milken Archive of American Jewish Music. And you were the founding director of the Milken Archive. How did your relationship with Lowell Milken come about? Were you members of the same shul?
Yes, I was the conductor for the high holidays at Stephen S. Wise Temple. And Lowell would come to services, and he paid me a very nice compliment. He came by after services and said, he had this list of pieces that he had written down. He said, "Who wrote this setting? Who wrote that setting?" And he wanted me to tell him who were the composers. I mean, first of all, I was thrilled that somebody understood that there were composers to Jewish music. You know, most people think it's Sinai, that it just wafts down from the sky, but he knew better than that. And when I told him that some of the pieces were my own, he said, "Well, that's very interesting. I enjoyed them." And I said, "You know, Lowell, if these pieces aren't recorded, these Jewish pieces aren't recorded, they're not going to survive, because people don't read scores the way they used to read scores. They have to listen to it. And especially with the internet and the electronic pipeline, it has to be recorded." So he said, "Well, why don't you develop a proposal and give it to me, and we'll think about it." And so I did, and the Milken Archive of American Jewish Music was created. It was created as a very finite project when I was on there. It went from the beginning of the 20th century in America to the camp songs in America, so it was really like 70 years of music. And it included, you know, all of the music of the classic reform, and then in the conservative music, and all of the people that were writing for it, and ended with the Debbie Friedman and camp music and so forth. It really told the story of American Jewish music. And I made 14 CDs of that music, including the Jewish music of Leonard Bernstein, including the music of Yehudi Weiner, and it was a very comprehensive 14 CDs. And then it became expanded, and I had to go back to being a composer and earning a living for my family. And they went on to make another 50 CDs. And now Mark Kligman is very happily ensconced at UCLA with Lowell and continuing this good work. And I think that in retrospect, future generations will look back at all of the activities of the Milken family with Jewish music as much as we look back on, say, the Songs of Solomon by Salomone Rossi as something really unique and enduring. This is the kind of strength and energy we need to propel us forward. Mark is a good friend of mine, and I think the archive and the musical activities at UCLA are in very good hands.
I second that for sure. So we're going to listen to A.J. Davis's As the Heart Panteth.
All right. I have to tell you this. I didn't write this. But those of you who know classic reform music know that in those days there were the three S's, Spicker, Sparker, and Schlesinger. They were all organists. They were all wonderful musicians, and they all filled the need of setting pieces that needed setting. And most of you will not know this, that before the American synagogue sang Kol Nidre, on Erev Kol Nidre, in the Reformed temples, they sang this song, As the Heart Panteth. And I wanted to include this. I'm conducting this performance with members of the Eastman School of Music chorus. I wanted you to understand how grandeur, how the architecture of temples and how the grandeur of the music made God to be someone on a throne. This wasn't a God that you sat around the campfire with having s'mores. This was a God that you looked up to, and the music was like that. So listen to what they sang on Erev Kol Nidre back in 1900.
Now, Mark is a great timekeeper, and he just gave me a signal that we do have to leave time for our Q&A. So I am going to move us along, and we'll still hear some all the way through, but not all the way through. This is a kind of just a collage of many of Michael's activities and actions. And Michael, if you want to just say something quickly about what these evoke for you.
Well, starting from the upper left, I'm with Jonathan, who wrote a jazz service, Jonathan Klein. I produced it for the Milken Archive, and it was the first American jazz service. And it was initially recorded with Herbie Hancock playing the piano, and John didn't really like what went on there. So when we started the Milken Archive, I said, John, would you like another shot at recording the jazz service? And he was, at the time, he was teaching at Berklee School of Music in Boston, and he brought all his resources to that recording. On the bottom, I'm talking to conductor David Spear while I'm producing the session. Then we go to Robert Starrer in the next panel. He had a shock of red hair, and if he loved your music, he was very flattering. And if he didn't like you, God help you, he would give you he would tell you no in certain terms. That was me as a young kid. A CD of the Hollywood Pops. By the way, the Hollywood Pops was really the Israel Philharmonic. I just had to call it the Hollywood Pops. But they played as good as any orchestra in Los Angeles. A Legacy of Jewish Music we made with Nate Lamb. Faith Snyder will know this album, Made in America. This was our first collaboration together, and she just knocked my socks off. She was so good at performing. The 23rd song that you heard is on this CD. Heritage, on the upper right-hand side, is the music of the permanent exhibition of the Museum of Jewish Heritage. If you go into the gift shop there, you can get a CD of that. And then the last thing on this panel is I decided, I know we have some people who are Sephardic listening in on this, and so I wanted to do a set of settings of Ladino music, and Poverta Muchachica is one of them. And this was a time when I was exploring what else but Ashkenazic music. I really wanted to widen my palette. And so if you go to Transcontinental, I did 5 or 6 arrangements of those things. And that's this picture up there.
Very nice. So it gives you a broad brush.
Well, you know, the very interesting thing about being a freelancer is that you never know where your next buck is coming from. So you work hard because you have to put food on the table. And for all of this time that I was in Los Angeles, I was always working at something. If I wasn't working on a TV show, I was working on Jewish music, I was working on educational music. And so I'm very happy to say that I have a body of work to share at this point in my life. These are my 3 songbooks. You can see the aging. It's like the picture of Dorian Gray. And they have a lot of my synagogue music on them, and they're all available at Transcontinental. And, you know, I was thinking about this the other day. Even though I wrote that music back at COZ camp all those years ago, I don't think the reform movement has gone very far away from those years. They're still doing basically folk music on guitars. And the only reason that I had any voice, don't forget, one of the campers when I was working at COZ camp was a little girl who thought that she could write music also. And she listened to all the stuff that I did and asked me, what chord are you using here? How are you strumming this? And her name was Debbie Friedman. So I figured Debbie Friedman, nowadays she has a school named after her, you know, so that says where the ACC is now. They are still working with folk camp music and haven't moved very far off the dime. But if they did, this was piano music. And this was piano music for their music director to teach. And that's why there is a dichotomy between the sound of what's happening in temples today and what could be happening in temples today.
Michael, we're going to get to that in a couple of minutes. Let's just proceed. Okay. And then you became an author. And I think, you know, this speaks to what you're getting at also. Michael authored this book. He mentioned it earlier, Jewish Music as Midrash, What Makes Jewish Music? And I'm curious, what motivated you to write this book?
Very simple. I used to do personal appearances at different temples, and they would play my music. And then there was always somebody in the audience when we did a Q&A, they would say, but what makes this Jewish music? And I would say, well, I cut 2 measures off the coda or some joke like that. But they weren't happy with that. So I really had to address in serious terms what I felt made music Jewish. And I came to the conclusion that it wasn't the ethnicity of the composer, because, you know, we have Ravel and we have Bruch and we have all of those non-Jews writing Jewish music. And it isn't the sound particularly, because if the more Jewish music you know, the more you know that depending on where you are in time and in location, the music sounds very different. You know, when the Rossi's time, they were convinced that he was writing music for Christians, but he wasn't. So there had to be somebody to think this through. And what I came to the conclusion was that really what makes music Jewish aside from, the famous historians, Jewish music for Jewish occasions by Jewish. I'm not so sure of that because I'm not sure Irving Berlin's White Christmas is a piece of Jewish music. So that takes care of that definition. What I think, though, is two things. I think for it to be really Jewish music, it has to have elevation. It has to take the idea of a setting, the text of a setting, or the occasion or the ritual and elevate it in some way so that we can be proud to be part of this Yerusha, this tradition, number one. And while it is elevating it, it also has to dig deeper. One thing I found with many of my colleagues is that they seem to be satisfied with too little. If something is just okay, they will lionize it and make it the most wonderful piece that they ever heard. And they won't even try and come to something that takes a little bit more rehearsal and is more challenging, that might be more elevated. They have to dig deeper. And so this is what I was trying to tell my community. I said, look, if we dedicated ourselves to elevation, and we dug deeper, that story about digging in the sand to find the jewels, that Hasidic parable, if you dig below the sand deeper, you'll find the jewels, but you have to dig deeper. So when I got my PhD, people said, well, PhD really means piled higher and deeper. And I thought it was, not quite nice. But as I thought about it, it means presenting higher and deeper music. It means seeking that elevation and seeking that real truth that you have to work a little bit harder at. And this is what I write about, not as a music historian, chas v'chalila, I make that caveat again, I'm a composer, but as someone who has been in this community for a while, what I think the attributes of good Jewish music are. And this was in its third printing, so obviously people have read it.
So on that note, I wanted to ask you, what do you mean by Jewish music as midrash?
Yeah, I love you, Marsha, because you're asking me all the right questions. Look, I grew up singing Bayom Ha-Hu, Hi-Ho, the cherry-o, Bayom Ha-Hu. And I read the text. I had the absolute chutzpah to read the text. On that day, the Lord's name shall be one, and there will be unity, there will be yichud. And certainly that setting of Bayom Ha-Hu did nothing for me. So I understood that my job as a composer was to take that text, which comes at the end of a service. It's something that we take home with us. I mean, the whole purpose of a service is to attain a yichud with God, isn't it? And we have to have music that is more sensitive to those texts instead of being a Prussian marching song. So I said it, and Faith Steinsider is singing it.
Okay, let's listen. It's a far cry from what you just sang. Oops.
Bayom
beautiful, just beautiful, and certainly very different from what had come before.
And that's what I mean by midrash, that if a composer really understands the text, that they can add a layer of meaning to it that heightens it and at the same time digs deep so that it communicates a feeling, in this particular case, of yichud.
Now we're almost at the close, and I didn't want to let you go without having a little bit of a taste of some of Michael's life cycle works that have become very well known and well used, and to listen to a children's chorus again. So we're just going to hear excerpts of these, but he's got the Bini and the BT for the baby namings. Let's start with that. And now the circles for the wedding ceremony. And this is part of, Michael's written a number of wedding ceremonies, and this is a portion of one.
She circles her beloved, creating a sacred space, a circle for their family, protected by God's grace, a shelter and a haven for their new married life, where they will live together as husband and wife. Ve'eras tichli le'olam le'olam, b'tzedek u'b'mishpat u'b'chesed u'b'rachamim. He circles his beloved and
now the Oseh Shalom.
This, by the way, singing this is my good friend Cantor Herschel Fox, who I believe is listening in on them. And Herschel has done wonderful things for me while I was in Los Angeles, and I considered him to be one of my closest friends.
Okay, here we go.
Oseh Shalom b'mirumav v'yaseh Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'yimeru amen.
Oseh Shalom
Okay, sadly, we have to move on. We're running out of time. So I didn't label this chapter 5 because who knows how many chapters Michael has ahead of him. But now you've traveled back to the East Coast and you're in semi-retirement in Boynton Beach, Florida. So
I've never worked harder in semi-retirement in my life. I'm working on 3 CDs as we speak. I've written a novel, and I'm doing all of these Zoom lectures across the country. It's amazing what's happening.
So Michael, is it okay if we skip this last one so we can go on to a very important topic that we want to close with? And then I have a little closing song, Your Sim Shalom, which is so beautiful. So with your permission, I will go forward.
Okay.
Sorry about that. So we're at the end of this amazing discussion with Dr. Michael Isaacson, and I hope you all have now learned, those of you who did not know before, what an amazing talent Michael Isaacson is. And he has a lot of thoughts, some of which he's expressed over the course of the last hour, about the present and future of what I like to call Minhag America, because everything that we've heard today is really something that stems from the American experience. It's something that has come from Michael as a result of all the influences and inputs that he's had over the course of his lifetime. And we've had a number of discussions about, where people sit on the timeline. How old were you during, say, the Vietnam War? Were you even born yet? And it's hard to know the degree of unintended consequences that have come forward. We had a chat about all the guitar songs that came out of the folk tradition and the extent to which they kind of took over in the culture of synagogue life. They sort of spilled over from the folk rock era into the synagogues, but they took hold. And Michael, I wanted to ask you if you could speak for a minute or two. I know this is a whole other conversation, but about whether you see it as unintended consequences or new directions in terms of where Jewish sacred music is going.
Well, maybe it's a sign of my age. When you're 75, you begin to remember more of what happened in the past than what's happening in the present. But from my vantage point, and I try and listen to everything. I try, whether it's all of the Lechadodis at the Cantor Assembly or everything that's happening on Mifgash or, in American, and not only in Jewish sacred music, but I have many friends who are music directors at Protestant and Catholic churches, and we all share the same idea, is that there seems to be a kind of lethargy. If I could write a piece now, I'd write "Sleep is a Work," Wachet auf, because I feel like everybody's just taking this soft folk music that was old during the 80s. And now it's 40 years later and we're still hearing this kind of same song, same music in the temples. And I don't think there's much energy going on. I feel bad to say that, but I think that's analytically where things are. Ironically, the COVID-19 has brought us into the 21st century rather, because it has allowed us not only to go to our shul in the neighborhood, but to go and see what's happening in New York or what's in California or what's happening in the middle of the country and really get, and I've also listened to some services in England because I didn't want to disappoint my friend Alexander Knapp. So I know that, this folk business is insidious. And unless we get some new blood and some energy, we're going to be stuck in this morass of easy listening for the rest of our lives.
And we could talk a bit, Michael, about the absence of serious music education and composition education, et cetera, which has a lot to do with, I think, this kind of dearth of new Jewish music that somehow revivifies the, I don't want to say the good old days, but at least takes in some of the experiences of the past and molds them into something new that people can relate to.
Look, when I was growing up, Israel was growing up. We all wanted the excitement of hearing the latest music from Israel. We all wanted to hear what was going on there. Now, Israel has become a little complacent. We've become a little complacent, and everybody's worrying about just surviving the plague now. But I think that this whole Zoom business, this whole living Judaism online, if you will, is going to change things. It has to change things. Not only will people be going to synagogue physically, but they'll be going to synagogue online. This isn't going away. It's too dynamic for it to go away. And consequently, those people who program for these services are going to have to say, well, who am I competing with? If I'm competing with Yu Zhuang playing piano and anybody could listen to her play, then I better get some music that's more literate than what I'm doing for services. And I think that's going to push people ahead. I hope so. Because we have a great message to share with the world. That's the bottom line. And if we share that message with trite music, and share that music with just the least, facile, expendable sound, we are doing a disservice to our own Yerusha. And I hope that doesn't last for too much longer. We need literacy, you're right, musical literacy. We also need musical adventurousness, and we need to be reminded of our mission. If we're going to be Or Lagoyim, we have to be Or to ourselves first.
Okay.
Well, what a wonderful note to end on. And Marsha, thank you so much for bringing Michael Isaacson to COZ today. Michael, I do wonder what would have happened. Marsha, maybe you can stop sharing your screen and then we can see you nicely. I do wonder, Michael,
Gerald, can we just play a little clip of what is, I think, Michael's most famous piece? Just a brief clip, and then maybe we can have some questions, because this is.
No, we are already in extra time. You know that.
Oh,
so
okay.
We can have some questions, and I'm not in a hurry. But if people have to go, they go. We've done 2 hours now and 10 minutes, so it's been enthralling. So not to worry. If you and Michael are ready to stay, so are we. So
okay, we will stay.
Play it.
Sim shalom tova v'racha ba'olam chen v'chesed v'rachamim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael amecha.
go, contact info for Michael, and you'll see his favorite, egg creams. And that's what his email address is. So
I'm not sure I know what egg cream is.
it's
But
an American drink.
what my question would be, what would have happened had you not taken the job as a camp guard? That's the question. What would have happened to musical life in Minhag, America? And
We would all be drowning, Geraldine.
it's not a question you need to answer, but if there are people, they've made some really wonderful comments in the chat to thank you and to say how wonderful and fantastic the program has been. But if there is somebody who wants to say, you know, would like to make a comment or ask a question, you know, I don't mind. I'm happy to stay if you are. So raise your hand in some way. And perhaps, Marsha, as I say, if you can stop sharing the screen, I'll be able to see everybody, which would be nice.
Dana and I just wanted to say hello to Michael, and it was a great program.
Loved you.
Thank you all.
We miss you.
I miss you too. I'm waiting to hear you guys do a duet
Marsha,
album.
just stop
Yeah,
sharing.
no, we don't sing anymore. But I'm still teaching at JTS, and Nancy says until I am laid down on the ground, I'm going to be stuck there. I'm going to be 75 now too, and she won't let me retire.
Trying to get
Ready. I'm not letting him retire.
I would like to say a word, if I may. This is Murray Simon in Sarasota, Florida.
Well, I know you.
Please
hope
do.
So. To Michael Isaacson, I have to publicly say thank you, because Michael did one of the most compassionate things I have ever experienced in my life. Our daughter Rachel passed away at the age of 28 from leukemia. And the following year, I was attending the Cantor's Assembly Convention in Detroit, sitting at a table by myself, and Michael sat down right next to me and said he was so sorry to hear that our daughter passed away. What was her favorite text? And I said she always kept the poem by Hannah Senesh, Yesh Kochavim, on her night table. And it didn't take more than a couple of few months, and Michael composed the most beautiful setting of that poem. And we were so grateful for this act of compassion and warmth and caring. And I just wanted to say publicly to Michael, thank you for that beautiful, beautiful piece of music which captured Rachel. And just to let you know, in 2014, we dedicated the Rachel Simon Hillel Theater on the campus of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and your piece opened up that dedication.
Thank you.
Again, publicly, from our hearts, thank you so much for your act of compassion and kindness.
It was my honor.
You're quite a mensch.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for sharing everything that's gone on today. It's been a most wonderful session. And Marsha, thank you so much for bringing Michael. Michael, I hadn't really known about your music before, and I'm overwhelmed and really so grateful that we've had this opportunity. So thank you to everybody for being here and for sticking it out with us. Sorry that we left you in the waiting room for a while, but it was worth the wait, hopefully. And love to everybody. I will tell you that next week we're having Vanessa Paloma Elbaz and Anita Doctor from Estonia bringing us the ancient history and into traditional songs, Jewish songs of birthing in the Sahara. So it couldn't be more different from what we're doing today, but you know, there's no telling, there's very much cross-fertilization in COZ. We're not having a session on the 18th of May as being the end of Shavuot. The 25th of May, Terrell Dobbs and Stephen Muir will be tracking down composers from the Warsaw Ghetto. And at last, on the 1st of June, Isabel Gans and Susanna Weich-Schachak are going to bring us the Judeo-Spanish song that they were frozen out of in Texas earlier in the year. So hopefully we'll see you next week. Thank you again, Marsha and Michael, and see you next week. Goodbye.
I just want to thank Michael publicly for the opportunity to get to know him and to have some time with him to really be able to get a feel for the whys of his output. And
I'm glad to see all of my friends. Thank you so much, Marsha. And Geraldine, I'll send you a recipe for making a chocolate egg cream.
I think my husband would like that, so thank you. I look forward to that.
And everybody stay safe and be healthy.
Egg cream is not as easy as you think.
Thank you. Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.